dia a todos. Em primeiro lugar, eu gostaria de agradecer às pessoas que me ajudaram, especialmente as secretárias, assistentes e professoras do IEAT, do CIRIPLA e do Centro de Estudos Africanos. E também os professores Maurício, Eduardo Neto, Eduardo Vargas, Cássio, Paula e Marie Claire. That's what my 2 months of Portuguese training. I won't belabor you with that much more of my Portuguese, but I do want to say that it has been an extremely productive experience for me. I really did not know quite what to expect because of the shift and the length of time and the lectures that I would give. However, through this process, I think I have been able to better understand the project that I am working on and what it can offer. The interaction with the students and colleagues here at UFMG has been extremely fulfilling for me. I have learned a lot, and I think in the process I have said something along the way that may have been interesting to one or two of you, maybe more, I don't know. I'll try to say some interesting things today. Wait, let me bring my, I think I have to sit over there because I have to operate this thing after going through all of this. So I'm going to move. The topic that I would like to speak about is to talk about 5 African diasporas. I want to do this in a way that problematizes what we think of as the African diaspora and asks us to think logically and rationally sometimes about these subject matters of which typically we think we already know a lot about. The 5 diasporas that I would like to speak about are here in front of you. The first one I like to think of it as Earthseeds, as this group of Africans which populated Africa and then spread around the world and populated the world. All of the continents were populated by this group of people. Now, most anthropology and archaeology and paleontology and groups of geneticists agree with this monogenetic origin of humanity, and I like it as well. It's pretty consistent with the stories I have to tell from a demographic point of view. Now, African migration continued to happen even once there were great civilizations formed in Africa, formed in Asia and Europe. There has never been a moment where the world has been cut off from Africa or Africa cut off from the world. These old theories really do not have much to base themselves on, and they lead to a very bad way of thinking. And I like to get away from bad ways of thinking. But this is those migrations which would have put Africans in Europe and Africans in India and Africans in China prior to the rise of Islam, and definitely prior to the rise of Christianity. So Africa's interconnection with the rest of the world already existed. And then there was a great period of a lot of people from Africa being moved to Asia. And this was with the Arabic and Islamic colonization of the northern parts of Africa and the Arabic slave trade to Asia from Africa. And it's very important to remember that the Arabic slave trade was just as big and maybe even larger than the European slave trade in African bodies. But this is another diaspora, this European and Christian enslavement and colonization of the African continent and African people. This is how Brazil got many of the people that inhabited this continent, along with the Europeans who came to colonize, and the indigenous who were already here. The fifth African diaspora results from more of the modern intercommunication and circulation of people. That would include the Senegalese who are moving in significant numbers to Sao Paulo and Rio, but would also include the Haitians who are moving to different parts of Brazil, and the large numbers of African diaspora individuals moving back to the African continent. So these are events, these are moments, and this is mainly what I'm trying to get at through this presentation. So just bear with me as I take a particular kind of turn to get you there. Now, here's the problems I'm dealing with, and they really resolve around these four questions. And let me just state them as questions and give you provisional responses or replies to these questions, and then I will try through the presentation to establish why these questions are the important questions for us today. Well, at least they're the important ones for me, and I hope to convince you that they're important ones for you as well. Can we have a scientific study of human populations? This is a fundamental problem which I was confronted with as a young demographer about a little less than 30 years ago. And the reason I was confronted with this problem is because the study of statistical and demographic reality really does take a certain disposition. That is, it is something which does offer the possibility of us being scientific and not allowing our science to be dominated by the ideologies that are of that particular day. I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. However, it has rarely been the case that human beings have existed in a context where their own politics and ideology are not contesting their ideas about science. Whether this is the question of if the earth revolves around the sun, or does the sun revolve around the earth, and the commitment of certain individuals to one interpretation or another can lead to a lot of political debates and discussions. And in the case of the earth, it led to a religious conflict and many scholars being put in jail because they said and they gave an answer which did not agree with the church's answer. Around 1500 or so, an idea about enslavement was introduced. This idea was to base enslavement on a new notion of race, a new notion of human difference. This idea was coupled with a new idea about colonialism. This new idea was to couple colonialism with race, to justify colonialism on the basis of race, to justify enslavement on the basis of race. Ever since that time, our ideas and discourses about who is a human being have been put in question, because we have spent much of our time declaring certain people fit to be human beings and other people not fit to be human beings. And this in itself has put in question much of what we call science. Because scientists have not been outside of this process, they have been intimately involved in the process. Now, how we look at people has always been important, but it has become extremely important as of late, because now we use visual images of people as a way of interpreting who they are. These visual representations that we have are extremely influenced by our ideas of what these visual cues mean. What do they represent? And as a consequence, our internalizing of what they represent influences how we see what has happened in the world, how we see it happening. So representations are a reality in the modern world, and the modern is represented by these images. Now, in some ways, you may say, well, he's just trying to justify the fact that he makes films, and he also tries to do demographic analysis. And these are two very extreme forms of representation, yet they serve a similar purpose. Both attempt to summarize information. They attempt to represent reality in a way that allows us to understand something by giving us a summary of a lot of information, recognizing that we cannot experience the entire event. In terms of statistics, it takes lots of numbers and gives you a summary index about those numbers, because you can't look at all those numbers or all the cases and come away with an understanding. So the way we summarize the information is we develop an index and we give it some logical representation, and then we allow you to talk about that, or we try to talk about it. The same happens with a visual image, which is portrayed to you either in a photograph, painting, or visually and audibly and moving in front of you in a video. It's impossible for you to see everything going on around the particular production of that specific image, yet that image comes to represent something for you. The better it represents it, the more meaning it has, the more power it gives you. So images are important, and they're important for us understanding life, and they're important for us to communicate in the modern world. In my view, to understand human history, it is essential that we understand modern enslavement, especially that enslavement of Africans which took place in between 1500 and 1900. It is very important. And the reason it is important is because class is important. The environment is important. Gender is important. But if you do not understand race, you will miss one of the most important elements that confounds our understanding of class, gender, and citizenship, and many other parts of human identity that we have today. Also, our philosophy and our philosophies of science have been over-determined by enslavement and colonization. And you have to remember that these experiences only recently ended and have been with us for most of the past 500 years. So I have taken it upon myself to at least think in my work that it is important that we emancipate humanity from this kind of oppressive thinking. And that's important. Now, part of that comes out of my entrance into scholarship, comes as being part of a movement in the United States. Therefore, I've always had a very aggressive attitude towards academics and how it can be used
to help people. I like the whole notion of science for science's sake, but I kind of think that I want to engage in a kind of science that cares. And I'm most concerned about a kind of science that cares. If a Martian came down to Earth and wanted to study human beings, I'm not sure how much weight I would give them in understanding human beings if they didn't have some empathy for the human situation. Today I want to talk about how race, Africa, and the African diaspora are related, and why we need to redefine what it means to be a human. That is what we are talking about. That is what emancipation was about. That is what African independence was about. That is what the global movement for independence that happened in Asia and all over the world was about. Redefining humanity. That is what these movements of asserting the humanity of African and African descent people around the world have been about. It is not simply defining what it means to be black, but it is defining and redefining what it means to be white, what it means to be indigenous, what it means to be a human being. It's something that we all have a right to discuss, and as we discuss it and change the meaning of it, we transform the social situation that people live in. I argue that race can really only be solved by the redistribution of resources. Okay? I just want to say that up front. I am not a person who believes that if you simply take a number of black people, for example, and put them in the same distribution of jobs exist in a society. That is, if you have 10% of the population that are lawyers, then the black population should make up the same percentage that they are in the population of those lawyers, of those engineers, of those teachers, of those. That's not a solution. It may be a necessary step to finding a solution, but that is not a solution to what I call the problem of race. And I'll come back to this question of race not being, for me, something that is a neutral category which we just have. Because race has always been about struggle. Race has always been about resources. Race has always been about dehumanizing someone. Race has always been about conflict. Race has always been about domination. Okay, that said, let me go back to my preliminary conversation about the African diaspora. And I'd like to start the conversation about the African diaspora by looking at what has come of the African diaspora and presenting this to you in a way which may be slightly different than you had. One of the things I like about demography is that demography, I'm going to figure this out here soon. Oh, there we go. This is basically the heart of the science of demography. This is the demographic balancing equation. These balancing equations are beautiful, and you know they kind of got their start among physicists and engineers and people like that. There are a lot of versions of it, but this is one. This is the basic demographic balancing equation, without any need for any definition of anything but that the people are humans. And this is a graphic demonstration of this equation over the past 10,000 years. And I like to think of it as a really beautiful figure, a nice graph. You may have seen it before. Definitely anybody in here vaguely associated with demography has seen it a lot. Let me talk about a few things about this, this graph, if you will. About 110 billion people have lived on the planet Earth since the beginning of humanity. That's what this shows you. Over 7 billion have lived in the last 50 years. And about 7% of that total number of humans have lived in the past 65 years. And more than 80% of the human experience occurred before 1750 and the Industrial Revolution. And more than 90% of the human experience occurred before 1950 and the Information Revolution. So what you get a sense of is that the 7 billion people we have on Earth now really represent a small part of all the humans who have been here on the planet. And that for most of this experience, these 110 billion have not experienced the ideas that we have about difference, because these ideas we have about race and racial difference, about nation and national difference, are relatively new. Now this is that curve condensed a little bit so that it just focuses on the period of 1950 until 2050. And you can see from this that the human population increased to 3 billion, which is a big number, and a very big number for humanity on planet Earth, by 1999. What us demographers like to talk about is a doubling time of about 40 years. That's how long it took the population to increase in its size. Now the latest projections imply, and that's what these are, some late projections. These are from the US Census Bureau, but they would be the same if you were looking at the ones from the United Nations. They're basically, everybody agrees on the general contours of this pattern of change and growth. So the human population is projected to grow from 6 billion in 1999, our current 7 billion, to 9 billion by 2042. That's kind of a half doubling time of 43 years. So you can see that there's actually a slowdown in the process of human growth, or at least in terms of the doubling time that it's taken. Now there's a politics to the demography or identity and the demography of difference. And this is important. It's important if someone studies only one racial group, and it's definitely important if they study many racial groups, and it is secretly important if they simply merge all those groups together and don't talk about the racial implications or the racial identities which underlie the estimates that they may make. Now, citizenship, race, ethnicity, religion, and gender have become major aspects of our modern identity, so much so that the demographic balancing equation is always rewritten to fit our understanding of difference. That very general table that I gave you, which is probably the most informative table that demographers could give you, is often sliced up. In fact, it is always sliced up. And it is sliced based on citizenship. It is sliced based on race and ethnicity. It is sliced in some places even based on religion and gender. And these things, it's not sliced that way because it's being done just trivially, but it's sliced that way because these things are considered to be fundamentally important in the political and social environment in which we exist. Now, the modern individual is always represented and re-represented by their identity. And often then, they need a card to prove who they are. And I travel a lot around the world, and if you've ever tried to travel without your passport, or you go somewhere and you lose your passport, you will see how fundamentally this is. It may vary some inside of different countries, but across different countries, it is fundamental. And these identity cards require different degrees of information. Some of them demand that you declare what your racial classification is. Some demand that you declare what your religious classification is. And you find this in these different documents. Some even want to know where you've been so that they will determine whether they will let you in the country based on where you have visited. So the history of identity creation can help us understand the role of human difference. My work focuses on race as a problem in human identity. Let's look at Africa and the African diaspora. But before I do that, I have to talk a little bit about race so that you don't misunderstand me. And it's easy to misunderstand it because for me, race is an illusion. Race is a socially constructed illusion which we must buy into in order to be able to talk sanely, to operate sanely, and to work politically in the now. And if we just take black and white people, they're supposed to represent extremes of a kind of racial continuum. But as I've said, if you had a chance to come to any of the presentations prior to this, black and white do not mix to produce brown. And there's a lot of shades of black and white. That is, there's a lot of shades of gray, and none of them are brown. Absolutely none of them are brown. And while this may sound amusing, it may sound trivial, the socially naive references to color is fundamental in modern representations of humanity. It's rare that we reflect on how our assumption of the blackness of some people and the whiteness of other people is part of our way of thinking about who those people are. That we have notions of what black culture is. We have ideas of what it means to be white and how a person can or cannot do the samba. We have those ideas. And where do they come from? How do we get them? And what do they mean to us has to do with our culture of racial thinking. Our culture of racial thinking does not have much to do with logic, reasoning, or thinking clearly. In fact, race requires that you think politically above thinking clearly. So the colors of the skin represent the social acceptance of race that we have. That's why we can have a politics of race. That's why we can make laws about race. We can make a law which enslaves certain people because of their race. The Pope can make a decree which allows people's humanity to be put sufficiently in question so that they can work hundreds of years producing excess wealth that stimulates the development of industrialization and capitalism as we know it now. So the acceptance of the illogic of race has a very practical implication for society. Ignoring this is to ignore some of the fundamental bases on which we could propose how social change could happen. And when we confound our understanding of racial realities with something that is what we say is reified to be real in itself, to have a material existence separate from these politics, separate from these kind of social constructions of our making. When we do that, we cloud our view of society. We cloud our view of human relationships. And we cloud our view to have a sane conversation about difference and about difference among people. So I said about myself in around 1993 to thinking about the demography of Africa and the African diaspora. And I sat down to write a book. I believe I had just finished one book, and I sat down to write another book called Thicker Than Blood, How Racial Statistics Lie. But I didn't sit down to write that book. I sat down to write a book on the demography of Africa and the African diaspora. But I found myself confounded by ideas of race and how they had so heavily influenced demographic research. And not in the way you may think. The way that I saw that it had so influenced demographic research is in the United States you had all of these researchers who were doing work on the demography of the United States, excluding the black population. And they said they were doing that because they didn't want to deal with the issue of race. Do you understand that? Can you see the reasoning behind that? Or some of them would say, if you put the African American population in, they mess up all the statistics. Because they die sooner, they're less educated. I mean, even their babies, they die of infant mortality quicker. They have more babies. I mean, they move around more. They mess up the statistics. You see? They did not see a problem in that. Now, I saw a problem in that because I was like, well, what is it you mean you're doing if you're doing a demography and you have to cut the people out who are doing the worst in the society in order to get a statistical representation of the society that you think is qualitatively good, but you've excluded the population which is relevant to the actual demographic processes you're looking at. So I had that problem. So I first tried to fight them around that problem. And I wrote papers on why they got it wrong about slavery, why they got it wrong about the family, why they got it wrong about fertility. And they liked that, you know, they published the papers everywhere. And I had a lot of very interesting discussions, but I thought those discussions were not far enough. Part of the reason those discussions were not far enough is because the logic of analysis that they were engaged in was based in a history of racial statistics. Understand, the history of racial statistics that I am talking about, that they were dominated by, was not that they would use those racial statistics just to define as being inferior, or the Africans as being inferior, or the newly freed, formerly enslaved as being inferior. But that the way of doing the statistical analysis, the way of doing the demographic analysis had its origins in eugenics. Okay, don't get confused, this eugenics with, you hear people talking about eugenics today. They have some relationships, but it is important to even recognize the distinction. The eugenics that I am referring to is that eugenics which argued for the sterilization of certain women because of their inferiority. The eugenics I am referring to is the eugenics that was used to argue for preventing certain people from migrating into different countries from other countries. Okay? Do not confuse the eugenics I am talking about. The eugenics I am talking about established the basis for the racial science that the Nazis used. Before the Nazis had racial science, there was eugenics. In fact, the eugenics, the racial science of the Nazis in the beginning, they argued with the eugenists that they needed to have more of their international conferences in Germany. Now, many of the eugenists were Jews, so they found that problematic at the time when the Nazis wanted to hold the meetings there, and some of them were opposed at the international level to eugenics moving in that direction. But the main point is that the logic of demographic and statistical analysis came out of eugenics. Galton, Pearson, Fisher, okay? If you know about the history of statistical analysis in society, in genetics, then you know these names. All of these individuals were eugenists. All of these individuals, if you would have talked to them, they would have said, now those black people are not exactly what we would call full human beings. Okay? That's the level of reasoning That's the type of logic that statistical and demographic analysis came out of. Therefore, I came to the conclusion, and I think you could agree with me, statistical analysis, demographic analysis needed to question how it was using its methods, even if it was only looking at white people, which it was rare, because white people is as much an oxymoron as black people are. White people is as politically defined as black people are. The definition of race, in fact, the politics of race, have not been neutral because they have come out of this context of white domination. Race and racial analysis, racial politics, have always been about white domination on planet Earth. So that's the kind of problematic I had with modern academics, which led to the nature of the project and the way that I am approaching the project. My first effort was try to understand slavery, but I argued that to understand slavery, to understand enslavement, to understand the demography of enslavement, it would be impossible to do it using normal statistical or demographic analysis. The reason being, nobody had the proper motivation to keep accurate records of the enslaved. Nobody kept a record of how many people died on the shores of Africa. Nobody kept a record of how many people died on the bottom of the Atlantic. Nobody kept a very good record of how many died from the transition from the boats as they arrived to the shore. And no one kept accurate records on plantations when those accurate records could have resulted in higher taxes being paid. Higher taxes being paid for how many you imported. Higher taxes being paid for how many were on the plantation. So there were all these motivations to give the wrong number. And in fact, if you look at the numbers using demographic methods, you find that they don't make any sense. They don't come out right. And you have to correct them. So I thought the best way to do this then is to do it in reverse. And then once you do it in reverse, start thinking about it better. So, and to do it in reverse, you would need to do a kind of experiment, a natural experiment, if you would. The natural experiment that I selected was to take a group of African Americans who had went back to Africa. And then I wanted to see how they did when they went back to Africa. Lo and behold, their racial similarity with the Africans, they're going back home to their brethren and sistren, did not work the right way. They died just like the Europeans who were coming to the west coast of Africa. I mean, one of the reasons West Africa was not colonized is because West Africa had more powerful diseases than Europeans had experienced in Europe. Now, when Europeans came to the Americas, Brazil, North America, when they came to the Americas, they had more powerful diseases than those people had had. And that resulted in those people dying substantially. But that didn't happen on the west coast of Africa. Europeans could bring all their diseases they wanted. The diseases that were waiting for them on the west coast of Africa sent them all the way back to Europe. So this group of going back, I thought that's the way you do it. And I did a lot of stuff to get, establish tools for really understanding historical demography. We developed different life table systems. We developed different methods for calculating life tables. We did all of these things in preparation for a project which could do a demography of the enslavement, which I contend still needs to be done. And as I showed in a couple of the presentations I did, that work still stands there to be done. And so I want to do that work, and I'm engaged in the project to do that work. However, I don't only do the demographic part of it. I think you need to show people and make the information available to people. So I do filmmaking and curating, and I do them in many different ways, some for television and some as independent projects. And the curating, I do it in museums, some for short exhibits of 6 to 7 months, and others from 3 to 5 year projects. all of them trying to look at these dimensions of Africa and the African diaspora, and to call in question the way we have looked at these groups of people. Okay, what about the African population through this process? Now, since the beginning of what I recalled as the third African diaspora, the continent of Africa has been considered a resource for development, a resource for development. That is, if you are supposed to be a developed country, you must be getting a lot of stuff from Africa. I think that's a different way of looking at it and looking at those who are developed, but it's pretty consistent. Look at those countries where they are supposedly developed and they become extremely dependent on the resources of Africa. In the first instance, on the bodies of Africa, on using African bodies to sustain their economies. This is what the process of enslavement was about. And today we find the same kind of thing in terms of needing coltrane, needing oil, needing gold, needing diamonds, needing copper, needing all of those things that are essential for the information revolution to exist. They exist in large quantities on the African continent. And everywhere in the world wants to have access to those resources. A few months ago, I went to a conference in Cali. It was on Africa and business with Colombia. I went to a few months ago, I went to another conference in Salvador, and it was on Africa and business with the African diaspora in Brazil. The other one was Africa and doing business with the African diaspora in Colombia. Now, mind you, there was not sufficient African diaspora businesses represented at either of these conferences, and I'm not sure they exist in either of those countries to compensate or represent the business that was supposed to come from Africa. So, wanting and needing the resources of Africa are fundamental to social development and economic development in modern societies. But what about the African population at this time? Now, this is looking from 500 to 2075 of the African population as a percentage of the curve that I showed you in the beginning. So this is the percentage of the African population. And these big dips in the African population represent moments where the trade in African bodies was really intense, whether it be the Arab trade in African bodies or the European trade in African bodies. Now, this is the Arab trade in African bodies. Okay, then there's a lull, and then there's a pick back up of the Arab trade in African bodies, and an acceleration of the European trade in African bodies. Often people say, how can we know if enslavement had an impact on the African continent? And it's easier to see if we juxtapose Africa with the rest of the world. And here, all I've done is taken the percentage of Africa's population relative to the other populations by looking at all of the historical records of how many people there were on Earth and where they lived, and then recharting this particular process. I did a lot of smoothing and things in order to make the data more sensible and make it work, but then this is what you get. So if we interpret this curve from 500 onward, we get that part where there is the pre-colonial Africa, but we also get that part where the Arabic slave trade is taking off, and you get these two dips that I was referring to. So the enslavement and the African population had a fundamental impact on Africa. Colonialism had a fundamental impact on Africa as well. However, in colonialism, you don't want to move the people out of Africa. In fact, you want to keep the people in Africa because now you have a different use for black bodies, and that's to work on the African continent. So in one of my projects, I'm going to show you some images for a couple of my projects at this point. One of the, I'll show you a clip from my latest film, which is African Independence. Let's look at the clip. Let's look at the clip.
Ghanaian veteran Charles Menson helps me understand the modern implications of this old relationship by summarizing life under British colonialism.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. How was life under British colonial rule?
Well, it was a question of master and servant. Now, when the British came in, they assumed responsibility for the government of the country. So this is how the relationship came about. There was that big gap between the country men and the foreigners who came to take over the reins of government. And so we were more or less subjugated. But gradually things started to change when some of us were trained both in the States and in England, and then ideas started to come for a change to take place in this country.
I visit with K.B. Asante, and he shares his views of growing up in the British colony of the Gold Coast.
What exactly was colonialism?
Well, I didn't think it was anything special. Now, in those days, we simply regarded the colonial regime as normal. Later on, when I grew up, I found a few politicians were questioning their presence here and what colonialism was all about. But when I was young, it was just a thing, and the aim was, in many ways, to be like the European, like the colonialists. It's as simple as that.
I sit down with one of the founding members of the African independence movement, His Excellency President Kenneth Kaunda.
You were one of the founding members of the liberation movement in Africa. How did you become politically active?
My father was a reverend in the Church of Scotland. He was sent to a country called Malawi today, and he was sent over in 1994 to northern Rhodesia, Zambia today. I was brought up believing love God, your creator, with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, all your strength. How would you relate to those he has made in his image like you? The message, command was, love thy neighbor as thou lovest thyself. This neighbor is not looked at in terms of color, not in terms of tribe, not even in terms of religion. I grew up in that atmosphere. There was a lot of discrimination, no doubt, in the country at that time. And because of that, I grew up as one of those objecting strongly discrimination in terms of color.
I think it was in London. I found the colonialism that is existing really in this so-called mother country. I found that the British were not, they didn't know much about the so-called colonies. They didn't think, many of them did not think much of us. Generally speaking, you found that you were not as normal. For example, when I sat in the bus, nobody sat by me. I got used to it because I could put my coat and books near me and nobody bothered me. But little things like this, you find that you are not regarded as a normal human being.
This was the case in East Africa as well. I asked Eloise Mukami Kimathi to share her views about life under British colonialism in Kenya.
How did the people suffer under colonialism?
watu wetua ati ole omete to de gai bitu tiene to le gai bitu la gai bitu.
And so these clips are from Africans who experienced colonialism and lived in colonialism sufficiently to be motivated to be leaders in the anti-colonial movement. All of them served and were very distinguished activists against colonialism and activists for African independence. Now, what they're describing, I hope you gather from it, at least what I gathered from it, was that here was a bad situation. We had a country, and you had people who came in, and they implemented colonialism. In the implementation of colonialism, they asserted their racial superiority. That is, their racial superiority as the British, as the French, as the Portuguese. And that this had a big impact on how the people in Africa would then view themselves. But this mythology of race only went so far. When they got in trouble and they needed to fight, they had no problem going to ask those Africans to come and fight for them. Now these few photos here, let's look at those photos. These images are of posters. And these are recruitment posters. And they're recruitment posters of the governments, the colonial governments, asking Africans to come and fight on their behalf. Oh, that's when it's a negative poster from the Italians against the use of black soldiers to fight against the Italians. However, they didn't have a problem using black soldiers in the Italian and in the German army when it was necessary. But when they were fighting against other people, they had a problem with that. Another moment on this curve is, so that's the point where you see colonialism, because most things are growing in Africa. That is, the quality of life is improving in Africa over this period of time in an absolute sense. Because in an absolute sense, the fertility is going up, and that's going up as a consequence of children living longer. The mortality goes down much slower, the general mortality of the population, but it also begins to decline as well. Now, the independence in Africa had a profound impact on the African population. Let's look at that clip now. This is a clip about what independence is all about. And then I'll try to bring all this together for you in a couple of minutes here. Okay.
Oh, my. Only 12 years after the historic Pan-African Congress in Manchester, England, did Ghana become independent.
Kwame Nkrumah returned from studying in the United States and England and spearheading the 1945 Pan-African Congress, becoming a symbol of African independence. I speak to his daughter, Samia Nkrumah, a member of the Ghanaian Parliament at the Nkrumah Memorial Park in Accra, Ghana.
Ghana, 1957. Everybody marks that independence as the beginning of the movement for independence on the African continent. Why?
Okay, to start with, Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence. But what is significant is the moment Ghana won independence, it started helping other liberation movements, actively helping them. And there are many, many stories to be told. From helping Algeria, the liberation movement in Algeria, to Guinea, to Southern Africa, everywhere. And that is why 3 years later, 1960, which is the year we call the Africa Year, the Year of Africa, 17 countries gained independence. It was not a coincidence. It was not a coincidence. Ghana was actively helping liberation movements in various ways. In fact, in '58, there was the All African People's conference here in Accra, where many would-be leaders of African states were present, attended. So there was a vision to help other countries become politically independent, and that confirms Kwame Nkrumah's statement on the eve of independence.
Our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with total liberation of the African continent.
Ghana, through Kwame Nkrumah, had put forward a list of proposals to help us unite as a continent. Common currency, common markets, common citizenship and borderless continents, central bank, common foreign policy and defense strategy. In short, a list of proposals and projects that Europe went to implement years after. So we know that we are pioneers in unity.
New leaders with democratic dreams for their new nations gave Africa and the world hope. At such a moment in history, everything seemed possible. And nothing captured this more than the movement in Ghana, the beacon of African independence. I asked His Excellency John Kufuor to place Nkrumah's relevance in historical context.
How relevant do you think the idea of, Nkrumah's old idea of African unity?
Very relevant. It's not as yet even fully realized or fulfilled. And Nkrumah was perhaps talking more politics than economics then. Now the world talks markets. The bigger your market, the more attractive you are. I believe this is the power of China and India. And there's European Union. Everybody is seeing the sense of combining to create a sizable market in the globalization process. So Nkrumah's statement, that statement, I believe, was quite prophetic. Whether he appreciated the economics of it or not, was prophetic, and his place in history, I believe, is above question. It led in the Pan-African struggle. So Africa is one continent, save people who should come together to command the respect of the rest of the world. Very good.
Like Ghana, other African nations provided critical assistance in the Pan-African struggle for independence, as His Excellency Kenneth Kaunda explains to me.
We had a duty to assist our colleagues in Angola, west of us, Mozambique, east of us, under the Portuguese, Zimbabwe, southern Rhodesia, in those days, because we were northern Rhodesia, they were under the British settlers. South Africa, Boers and the British mixed to form apartheid. Namibia, same thing. Namibia had been under the Germans before that. Mahatma Gandhi's student, Hamid Nehru, first Prime Minister of India, wrote like this in one of his books. When you are fighting against British colonialism, you can afford to fight in a non-violent way. Non-violent way meant defying unjust laws, being sent to prison for that, coming out continuing until you won. We follow that path. And when you're fighting other colonial powers, you can't afford to do that. You've got to fight using the gun. So, I could see that he was very right. For our colleagues in the other countries around us, we have to help fight in a violent way, using the gun, using weapon. How would we help them? At the time for our independence, we had to allow our colleagues to pass through Northern Asia, to come to Tanzania, here, under Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, who found places for them in the country, where they could go and train.
Okay, so he goes on to talk about the role that Zambia played, which is similar to the role that Ghana played in West Africa and East Africa. The point being here is that this is what was happening on the African continent, and Africans were fighting to redefine what it means to be a human being. And in their fight to redefine what it means to be a human being, they had to end colonialism. They had to constitute and institute independence. Often these battles were nonviolent, but they became violent. And in becoming violent, it was necessary and it was appropriate at that time, given the adversary that they were fighting, who wanted to keep them in a second-class status, in a colonial status, in a dehumanized position in the society. Oh, okay, wait, before I show you that, let me say this. Now let's look at the African diaspora. So this African diaspora is being defined by enslavement, and they are being defined by the struggle to end that enslavement. I'm assuming that you see the negativity in colonialism, that you see what it did negative to the people. I'm assuming that you recognize enslavement was not a good thing. It was not a good thing for the enslaved. They did not get taken out of Africa and brought to the Americas and given a very good life, a much better life. Their life in Brazil, their life in Colombia, their life in Peru, their life in the United States was worse. Everything got bad for them. So ending colonialism was very, very necessary. Ending enslavement was very, very necessary. But it also gives us an opportunity. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the quality of life experienced by the African diaspora at that moment, at the end of enslavement, in the abolition of enslavement, and basically to get a sense of the cost of enslavement among the enslaved. And I'm going to move through this rather quickly so that I can get down a little bit, because I see I have a little bit more here than I actually have time. I'm supposed to talk for 1 hour so that we can engage more with each other. So I'm going to use this as a summary of the figure that came before, which is a table that basically shows that the cost of enslavement, the higher mortality among the enslaved, which is a representation of that cost of enslavement, was bad. It was bad in the United States. It was bad in the Caribbean. It was bad in Brazil. Many people have done calculations of the quality of life among the enslaved. Some have even suggested that life was good in enslavement, or that the slave's life was not much worse than the life of those who were not enslaved. And that, somehow enslavement could be good. That's kind of a mythology that I can't wrap my head around it. And the numbers in this table just kind of confirm it. People are dying, and they're dying badly. And so enslavement is that kind of bad thing. Now, what enslavement then produces are populations which have experienced a lot of second-class citizenship because of the systems of race inside of those societies. Okay. But let me give a little bit more of a definition of that curve once we get past enslavement not being good for the enslaved. The curve of the African curve for the African diaspora reflects the Arab slave trade, which is the movement of people out of Africa to the Asian continent, or the Eurasian continent, or the sub-Asian continent in the Eurasian part, and the European slave trade. And the process of emancipation, abolition, second-class citizenship, affirmative action, civic inclusion, human rights, all these things which these populations have experienced. All right. I want to give you one more piece, and then I'm going to stop talking. For a long time, I've been interested and other people have been interested in some kind of calculation of the African diaspora population. And so I have been, you know, slowly collecting all of this information, participating on a few international committees which help consolidate some of this information, help get it from governments which didn't make it public and things like that, and to put the numbers together for it. And all the way up until I was just coming here this afternoon, I was putting these tables and a figure together. I finished the table, I didn't finish the figure. The figure is more of a comparison of racial diversity in various countries. But I did finish this table, which is an interesting table to me in a lot of different ways. Here's some of the information you get from this table. The total size of the African diaspora in 2010 in the Americas, that's both South and North America, is 153 million people, 303 people. The African diaspora in Latin America is only, you know, most of the African diaspora in the Americas is in Latin America. Now, you know, if you would have said that 20 years ago, people would have been asking you, what are you talking about? Because, you know, there are no black people here, there, and the other place. That has totally changed, especially in the last 15 years, where countries which had never before collected information on their black population began to collect information. And the changing concretization of the identity of being black, brown, or whatever configuration of that leads people to express something about being in the African diaspora has accelerated. And so one thing that you see, if you look at any two of these numbers, for example, if you look at the number here for, oh, you're not looking at the same thing I'm looking at. That's probably why you're thinking, what is he talking about? Especially after I went through so much to give you these few numbers. I know it may not look so exciting to you, but it was very exciting for me to get to this point. If you look at the numbers for Brazil, for example, they increased from 44 to 50. From 44 here to 42 here, from 44 to 50. And this is what people are talking about when they say that Brazil has become a majority African descent population. Man, it's not really that, you know, black and brown people were having babies more, because if you do an analysis of these data, they really were not. What produced this difference was people changing what they called themselves. This is the success, you know, from my point of view, the success of the African descent movement, the black movement in Brazil, is getting people to be conscious of what it means to be of African descent, and how somehow that is not as bad as it used to be. Now, if I take this table back, and I can take it back all the way to, I think it's 1860 that I have the numbers for, it definitely dips down really low with the big influx of immigrants from Europe. But from there on, it goes up until this particular point. But this particular change between 2000 and 2010 is because of people changing their classification. This change from 1990 to 2000 is because of people changing their classification. This is not because black people had more babies or white people start dying faster. It is because people start saying, I am brown, I am black, more saying I am brown. The change from 90 to 2000, more people said they were black. But then between 2000 and 2010, a lot of people start saying they were brown. Even some of those people who had switched to say they were black in 1990, they start saying they were brown in 2010. But I'm gonna do like y'all do. I'm gonna call them all black. Because that's how y'all get the whole majority is black thing. I'm with it, that's cool. Changes the whole demography of the African diaspora in the Americas. But you see, the second largest African diaspora population in the Americas is actually in the United States. And even in the United States, you see a significant increase in the number of people who are saying they're black. And why is that number increasing between 2000 and 2010? The reason the number is increasing in between 2000 and 2010 is not because black people in between that period start saying, hey, we got to get it on and pump out some babies up in this joint. That's not what happened. There wasn't a big influx from Africa of migrants to the US, which increased their number. The reason that number went up is more people in the United States who classify themselves as being mixed classified themselves as being African American. Interesting, it's happening there too. Maybe the Obama effect or something like that. I doubt it, but it could be. Now in Colombia, it starts getting interesting. In Colombia, they counted 1.5% of the population as black in 1990. I remember having a conversation with somebody in Colombia in 1995 where I said, hey, I was just up in, Quito, and I doubt this 1.5 thing because I couldn't find a white person in Quito. And I was hanging out in parts of Cali where I was like, I don't know. Well, they told me I was wrong. They whipped out the statistic. Being the demographer that I was I just kind of whimpered down and accepted that there were 1.5 million people. However, they came back with their next census, which was not in 2000, it was in 2005, and they found out they had 10.5% of the population that was black. That's when I started saying, wait, something is wrong with this whole process. And when I looked at the series of questions that they asked, they didn't even ask in the 2005 census the question everywhere. They just asked it some places. And they said in the other places, well, we don't think there are black people there, so we didn't ask it there. We only asked it where we thought there were black people. And I said, what science is attached to that idea that you preconceived, determined that you're going to exclude asking some people who may be people that think they are black if they are black? Anyway, that's what they did. So I expect and anticipate that that number will increase substantially in the next census, which they should be taking in the next few years. Ecuador is extremely interesting. If I go back a year, which I don't know why, but I did, the number is more similar to Colombia's number of about 1% of the population. But then by 2000, people are going out and they're telling people it's okay to say you're black. And look in the mirror, man, and look where you're at. Consciousness of blackness start changing things. People start responding to the question very differently, so that by the time they took their last census, which I think was in 2011, they came up with 7.1% of the population was black. And this substantial increase resulted in substantial changes of laws in all of these countries where these numbers went up. I mean, in Colombia, you had the law 70, and here you had your laws, and Ecuador had its laws. The United States didn't change its laws, they just kept the same, but we'll see, maybe we can get them to change theirs, stop shooting people in the street and stuff. So here you get a sense of where the African diaspora went. That is, it is big and it is thriving. Part of my argument is it is thriving, but it is not thriving in a complacent manner. In fact, if you look at the question of independence in the Americas, whether it's occurring at the beginning of the 19th century or the end of the 19th century, one of the most important elements of that independence is what are you going to do with these black bodies that you have enslaved? How can you claim to be independent? How can you claim to be doing something that is better than what was done to you as a colonial master? This question of redefining humanity in the moment of independence happens most effectively when these African populations are free, because what it means to be free changes. So much so that by the time we get the African independence movement, what it means to be a human being totally changes. Because no one after that can say that people coming from Africa are inferior, and it's reflected in the nature of their lack of being able to govern themselves, their lack of development, their lack of human participation in what civilizations have come to mean today. These struggles for affirmative action or civic inclusion, they raise some of the same questions, as do the questions about human rights and reparations, which take on a different meaning when we place them within the context of humanity and our efforts to redefine equality, justice among humanity. I want to thank you very much. I want to thank everyone who has helped make my stay here at the university, at UFMG, possible. I have learned a lot. I think this has advanced my project a lot, and I hope that you have been somehow touched and enlightened by the things that I have just said. Thank you very much.